Hello, my name is Jesse Dukes, and my favorite thing is a pair of movies by Richard Lester called The Three Musketeers and The Four Musketeers.
Welcome to the Finding Favorites podcast, where we explore your favorite things without using an algorithm. Here's your host, Leah Jones.
Hello and welcome to Finding Favorites. I'm your host, Leah Jones, and this is the podcast where we learn about people's favorite things and get recommendations without using an algorithm. I am really looking forward to today's conversation. I'm joined today by Jesse Dukes. Jesse is a radio producer and writer. He was retweeted into my feed. I still use Twitter. People were talking about his new podcast, Upper Middlebrow. But Jesse is a writer and radio producer from Virginia who is now based in Chicago or Florida. We'll talk more about that. He was a senior producer of podcasts at WBEZ, the lead producer of Motive and Curious City, and later editor for Curious City. His journalism work has been honored with a National Magazine Award, Overseas Press Club Award, National Headline Award, and his writing has been collected in the Best of American Travel Writing. He's a contributing editor at Virginia Quarterly Review and also a rock climber, surfer, home renovator, and gardener, and co-host of Upper Middlebrow, which is how we met. Jesse, how are you doing tonight?
I am great. I hope that it was people retweeting Upper Middlebrow and not just a person. That makes me excited about the possibility. The very first thing you said was that people retweeted my podcast, which is exciting news.
I think it was the day that you launched your first couple episodes, and I think, we've got common people in the Chicago world of journalism. So yes. That's how I found out about it. And then because you were starting with a bunch of books I'd actually read, I subscribed and have been listening.
Oh, that's terrific. Are you we have read a lot of Neal Stephenson. Are you a Neal Stephenson fan?
I'm a fan. I'm going to say I'm a qualified fan.
Me too. I would put it that way as well. Yeah,
he does such amazing world building. Mm-hmm. But then I'm pretty sure he almost drowned as a kid because there's always like a suffocation, a strangulation, a near drowning. And that's one of my big fears. So eventually I was like, someone is going to die in the way I am most afraid of dying, or almost die.
Yes.
And I've never found an interview where anybody asks him that. So that's like my number one question for someone to ask him. It's like, dude, what happened?
If we're not going to get him on our pod. He's very hard he doesn't do a lot of interviews, but do I have permission to ask him that if I'm ever in the position?
Yes.
Yes, right.
You have permission to ask him.
I remember you tweeting that. I had forgotten that was you, but I remember your tweeting that, and I was like, "Oh yeah!" And the dead Shafto brothers, brother from the Baroque cycle, who has some tragic accident. I forget involving sort of a screw up with a rope. I read that over a decade ago, and then there's certainly something in Fall, Dodge, and Hell. And then Goto Dengo.
Cryptonomicon, it's they're going up that tunnel and there's like only an air pocket every 100 feet.
Yeah.
Or every 100 meters or so, right?
Right.
The flooded tunnel.
Yeah.
The flooded mine shaft.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then the underwater cult in Diamond Age that you were just talking about.
We call it Underwater Burning Man.
Yeah.
It might be a little. It might be a little bit unfair to the Burning Man folks, but.
That, and then there's always a truly gratuitous sex scene that is like in the middle of the biggest plot point action scene, he'll stop and have sex with someone. It's like, really?
Sometimes, and in one case, a 15-year-old girl and a 30-something-year-old man too, which what we found kind of icky as well.
Yeah.
But he is a brilliant writer, and I think he's only gotten better in a way. I think he's a more mature person, but we're kind of, to be honest, I'm slightly regretful that we sort of had this idea of like, let's do a bunch of Stephenson stuff early in our podcast because we had originally made plans to do some other books, but then it was the 50th anniversary of Snow Crash. And so we were launching the podcast and we thought, oh, maybe Stephenson's going to get a lot of attention and we can kind of coattail that a little bit. And so we did those 3 Stephenson books and they've all been taped. They're all done. We're releasing the last 3, I think, this week, the week after that, the week after that. They're mostly all mixed. And I'll be very excited to move on to other stuff because our podcast is not just a Neal Stephenson podcast. We actually have very diverse taste. We're interested in a lot of different things. And I'll be excited to showcase that. Although there's also something to be said for going very, very, very deep into one creator or writer and observing the patterns and watching, watching the growth of anybody as an artist, I think is kind of fascinating to do. So, there's an upside as well.
There's a level where it makes you the blank check of authors. I don't know if you listen to Blank Check podcast ever.
I haven't listened to Blank Check.
So on Blank Check, they go through directors' filmographies, directors who had a big success early that got them a blank check. So M. Night Shyamalan.
Yeah.
Who are they doing now? They're doing the director of Trainspotting.
Danny Boyle.
Spielberg.
Yeah.
Elaine May. So
That's
they do
neat.
a pretty wide variety of directors, but they'll go through the whole filmography and watch as the films build on each other.
That's interesting. I feel like another kind of fun, thank you for that recommendation. I'll check it out. And I feel like another fun complementary thing would be like directors that somehow made their way out of movie jail, like Catherine Bigelow, who was successful earlier in her career. And then I think it was Strange Days that flopped. And she was making made-for-TV movies for a while. And then I think it was Hurt Locker or Zero Dark 30. I think it was the Hurt Locker that kind of pulled her back out into the A-list again. And she's so talented. And it was kind of frustrating. And actually, I don't know if you've ever seen Strange Days by Catherine Bigelow, but I think it's worth a watch too. But I think it was an incredibly expensive movie. So when it only made, like $90 million at the box office, that was enough to put her into movie jail, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it'd be interesting to see what would happen. I'm not a movie expert, but the movie market today with streaming and how things premiere and how people access content is so wildly different as an understatement.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know. It's interesting. I don't know if that's better for directors or worse. Although, yeah, I don't know. You hear some of them talking about it. And that, I should say with Upper Middlebrow too, it's me and my friend Chris Bagg. Up to this point, we've talked about books. It doesn't have to be books. The premise of the podcast is works of popular cultural production. And I think I'm imagining books will always be our bread and butter, if we keep making it, which I really, really hope we do because we're enjoying ourselves quite a bit. But I expect we'll also talk about some movies at some point too. In fact, we do a draft every 6 months or so where we kind of pick the next 12 things we're going to talk about that, and we both propose series, and then we have a kind of distributed sort of ranked choice voting system where we use to figure it out. And something that we almost did but did not do, and I'm going to propose again at some point, is all the Tom Ripley movies. So our second book that we talked about was The Talented Mr. Ripley by Patricia Highsmith in 1955. Yeah. And there are something like 6 or 8 movies with the Tom Ripley character. And
really?
Yeah. And I mean, many people have seen The Talented Mr. Ripley 1998 or 99 with Matt Damon and like every great actor, Jude Law, Philip Seymour Hoffman, Kate Blanchett. Gosh, I'm going to forget a few people. Gwyneth Paltrow. Wonderful film. There was one, though, with John Malkovich that was a British production that came out a little bit after that. There's Purple Noon, which was a French production with Alain Delon as a young man. There was one made in India. There's one that I have not seen yet that stars, I can't remember the name of the act, Barry Pepper, who's a character actor you see pop up from time to time. He was in the Coen Brothers version of True Grit and some other stuff. It also has Willem Dafoe in it. And
Wow.
and the weird one, there's Wim Wenders' film The American Friend, starring Dennis Hopper as Tom Ripley, which is as
Whoa.
weird as it sounds, but kind of wonderful.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping we'll do that one at some point too. I wanna
Nice.
talk Tom Ripley movies, but we'll do movies at some point. I'm sure we already have a few that we're planning, and maybe TV. And also we could do poems. I mean, Chris Bagg's a poet. We could do short stories. We could do comics. We could do some, as it says in the media contracts, some form of art not yet discovered.
Mm-hmm. So when the two of you went to define Upper Middlebrow, what were the brackets that you put around that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's an ongoing conversation. So
Yeah.
it's a name that just kind of popped into my head, and I will say, like, I did not make up that phrase, but I had been kind of kicking this idea around, and I had an idea a few years ago about doing a podcast where me and a friend read all the Patrick O'Brian novels, like Master and Commander, and like that 22 book series, which I still think is a brilliant idea. But I was like, with Chris, I don't know that he would be interested in that per se. And we sort of reconnected. So I just, like, in a phone call, we had a long phone call earlier last year, around this time last year, where we talked about books. And I was like, dude, this could be a podcast. We're good at talking about books with each other. And I like, to be a little bit immodest, I think we're both pretty erudite, and we're both, we know a lot of stuff, and we also both have spent most of our adulthood trying to understand what makes books good in different ways too. And so for me, the way I bracket it is popular works with high craft. The popular part, that's kind of objective, right? You can sort of point to statistics and sales. The high craft is obviously incredibly subjective. So, Chris and I might disagree about what counts as upper middlebrow. And so I also think, like my friends who created the Nerdette podcast at WBEZ, that upper middlebrow could also be sort of a verb too, that it could be as much about the kind of work that we're talking about as the practice of trying to understand what makes a popular work of cultural production great. Because I think what I think our show is really about is a tremendous amount of curiosity about, like, how is this writer or filmmaker able to do this, able to create this effect in us too. And I think we go into it with a lot of curiosity. When Chris talks about it, he tends to describe it more like the upper middlebrow as an actual sort of like shelf, like sort of between highbrow and lowbrow and middlebrow and upper middlebrow. He tends to describe it more that way, whereas I tend to bracket it in terms of what I told you earlier, popular high craft. So it's not about obscure works, and I feel like there's popular work that neither Chris and I find to be particularly well crafted. Although generally, if it's popular, they're doing something right. Like he and I were kind of throwing shade at Tom Clancy the other day. But, Tom Clancy is a much more successful writer than I am, and clearly, he's got something that he does well. Although I would say maybe Clancy's he's a very good plotter, but maybe the sort of depth of character and the beauty of the prose isn't necessarily there. Although saying that, now it kind of makes me want to go back and read. I believe his first novel was kind of like an independent, like The Hunt for Red October was published by a university press or something. Like it wasn't expected to be a hit. It was a sort of like, there's a lot of writers now who will kind of build an audience using the internet and that kind of, like Andy Weir, we're reading one of his books. And I mean, lots of writers do this now. And I actually think Tom Clancy was one of the first people to, or at least his first book was a hit in a way that surprised the industry. And now we think of him as like almost like emblematic of a certain kind of money-making mentality in the publishing industry. But he kind of came from an independent source.
Oh, it was the Naval Institute Press.
Yes, he was published by like the Naval Institute Press. I don't know what the Naval Institute is, but I assume that mostly what they publish would be sort of like articles about like a particular destroyer squadron in 1953 or something like that, and a particular.
And they're like, ooh, and a novel set in one of our in a submarine, fantastic.
Yeah, yeah.
We'll publish it.
Yeah, I think that's a very good movie that they made out of that book. I think I would consider the movie to be completely Upper Middlebrow.
I have not seen it in at least 20 years. I'm sure I saw it when it was maybe not in the theaters, but when, like on TV afterwards, but it's not something I've revisited.
Do you remember the cast? I mean, even the cast is like, it's Sean Connery, Sam Neill, Tim Curry.
Oh wow!
What's his name? The guy who played the snobby professor in Good Will Hunting. I think he's Swedish. Stellan.
It was like Robin Williams.
Stellan Skarsgård. No.
Yeah.
Who was Robin Williams' character's friend in that movie? But yeah, Stellan Skarsgård.
No, it's an amazing cast.
Yeah.
And it was definitely an event movie.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember when it came out, and I remember that it being a big deal. So, I'm 45, so I think I would have been in high school.
Yeah,
when it came out.
I think it came out in 92 or 93, so that adds up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. So, Upper Middlebrow, right now you've got a dozen episodes out or so?
I think it's 9.
9 episodes out?
Yeah, I think it's 9 right now. I got one coming this week, I think. I hope.
And if people had a Neal Stephenson phase, I mean, I started reading Neal Stephenson. There was just a year when I read kind of dystopian science fiction, and I started with Neal Stephenson. And it's when I was working in the early days of social media, public relations, so it was still Web 2.0. I was advising clients on Second Life. And I was like, and my boss kept talking about Snow Crash, and I'm like, fine, I will read the book that, like, came up with the words we're using in pitches today.
Right.
So that's kind of where and why I started, was because I was going into meetings talking about like, well, obviously this was defined by Neal Stephenson and Snow Crash, and I'm like, I've never read it, and I'm just pretending like I had.
So here's an analogy, and I don't mean to offend anybody with this, but
yeah.
I don't even think this is true, but for a long time, I was not so into the Grateful Dead because I found some of the Grateful Dead fans to be sort of annoying. And I later now would say, oh, I love the Grateful Dead, particularly the 2 albums that I think a lot of people point to, Working Man's Dead and American Beauty, which I think had sort of the best songwriting and songcraft. But I think they're a great band. And actually, I know a lot of Grateful Dead fans who are wonderful people. I could count several. I could name some right away. I would even say I'm a Grateful Dead fan. So, but there was a kind of period where there was a sort of somewhat unsavory, sort of druggy following the Grateful Dead around in the late 1980s, and people getting stabbed in the parking lot. There was a sort of unsavory quality to that, and maybe a kind of airhead quality that people associated with it, maybe unfairly. I think Stephenson's similar, which is that there are a lot of Stephenson fans who are in Silicon Valley, like kind of making problematic decisions and doing weird things and saying weird things, and I don't necessarily like there's a world that it's like he's become kind of an iconic figure to a part of the world that I am skeptical of.
Yeah, but
he's still a great writer, and I think Snow Crash is probably his best early book. I think it's so tight. I do think the way he kind of explores the sexuality of a 15-year-old character is icky and inappropriate. And we kind of put that down to youth
Yeah.
I think he's wiser person now, but yeah, he's an amazing writer. I mean, and it's interesting, and he does kind of merge a sort of engineer's understanding of information and information technology and coding. And he has this, I think this is the thing we talk about in our podcast a lot of times, is that he's really fascinated by what you could broadly call infrastructure, or whether it's the mathematical reality behind the world, which is what Cryptonomicon's about, or it's about the technologies that power the matter replicators in the Diamond Age, or in the early novel Zodiac, it's literally the physical infrastructure of Boston, and like the sewers and the subways and the estuaries, and the main character's always tooling around in a rubber raft, kind of poking his head in places where you're not supposed, where big companies didn't want him looking, because he was trying to catch them disgorging chemicals into the Boston harbor. I think that's really fascinating, and I think somebody who's got a kind of an awareness of the world in that sense, who sort of thinks like an engineer, but then also has the typewriter of somebody like a Hunter Thompson, just kind of a mad genius with prose. Like that's a pretty irresistible combination.
Yeah. Have you seen, I know that you're RVing around, camping around.
Yeah.
Have you made time to see the movie Megan?
No. That's a good idea. Sometimes I am RVing around, and sometimes you'll get a rainy day, and it can be fun to find a movie theater somewhere, and, sort of, or a hot, humid day where it's too hot to sleep in the RV, and finding a nice air-conditioned movie theater. Would you recommend it?
I would recommend it because, so I went with the friend who kind of like kept putting the Stephenson books in my hands.
Yeah.
And we walked out, and I was like, so Megan is basically the primer from Diamond Age, right?
Oh.
So that is all I will say.
Wow.
It's PG-13, so it's not a gory, scary movie. There's some jump scares, but the question of AI and a self-learning system and the relationship with children is like, it helped that I had just listened to your episodes on Diamond Age, and then I saw it and I was like, oh my God, I need someone to talk to about this. So that's your assignment.
All right, I'll watch it. And we can talk again about it. I will commit to that. I'll try to see it in the theater. I don't know. I'm in Central Florida right now, which is not you wouldn't expect. I don't know. Is Megan a sort of like blockbuster style, like major release, or is it more of an art house? I've seen.
It's a pretty major release right now, I think.
All right, and the E is spelled with a 3, right?
Yeah.
Like the TV show Numbers.
Yeah, she's a 3rd generation android.
Ah, right. All right.
So.
I will check it out. I do enjoy those AI, like, Her was good. Wait, do I have the name right, or is it she? Am I getting the tense of
her? It's her.
It's her. Yeah, you could make another movie like that called She. It's a tip for anybody who needs a name. If Her was taken, you could go with She.
Yeah. Yeah, this takes the relationship of her and says like what happens when that relationship is with a traumatized child. So
yeah, that is very Diamond Age. That's fascinating. Yeah. That also reminds me a little bit of Klara and the Sun. I don't know if you read that Kazuo Ishiguro novel that came out about a year ago. But that's basically like a robot playmate for a rich girl who has an AI too. I imagine they're going to make that into a movie at one of these days. They tend to like to make that kind of story into movies, and it's devastating. I had it's a wonderful novel. I think we'll probably talk about it on Upper Middlebrow one of these days, if we make it past. What's the sort of like, I feel like a lot of people start podcasts, and some people realize it's more work. I didn't. I've been doing podcasts forever, so I knew just how much work it was going to be.
Right.
And I'm still having fun. And kind of the way it seems like you do this too is you kind of create a cadence and a rhythm so that it's work, but it also feels enjoyable and doesn't ruin your life doing whatever you need to do.
Yeah, this one I started during COVID, during like peak lockdown. And what was great about it was, if nothing else, I had a real conversation with one person a week.
Yeah.
Right? It wasn't about COVID, grocery washing. It was about something other than like COVID.
Yeah. That's brilliant.
And then I got hooked on it, and I'm like 130 episodes in. So I feel like it's stuck.
Congratulations. Yeah, I think you're over the hump. I 100's a big deal. I feel like even if we do it for a year and we feel like we're in a good rhythm, that means we'll keep doing it. I mean, with Chris and I, we're very good friends, but we live on opposite sides of the country, and we are both very busy people, have been. And so we hadn't really talked very much in the last decade. And so part of the joy of it, too, has been rediscovering our friendship. And Leah, you were the first person who has reached out to me because of that podcast. Like, you're the first person who is like, oh, so no matter what happens, like, it did that. It got me onto your podcast.
Yes.
And thank you for that. And but yeah, podcasting is a great way to build and sustain relationships with people. And it's neat that so many people are, I'm old enough, well, we're about the same age, but I have been in podcasting long enough to remember when almost nobody did it. And it was really, most of the podcasts early on and ones that I were part of were just a sort of way of putting a radio show on the internet. Like, it was being made for the radio, and you would go ahead and put it up as a podcast feed too.
Right.
It was a way of kind of getting another audience for your radio show. And, there were a few podcast first things that I participated in, something called the Big Shed podcast, and some other things like the Radiotopia people and 99% Invisible. So I can remember a time where there were very few podcasts, and there were only a handful of people making kind of podcasts about creative things. And now there's this wonderful proliferation. It's very exciting.
Yeah. I think it's been really exciting to watch. Like I said, when I was doing social media at PR firms, our clients would come and say, I want to do a podcast. But what they meant was maybe they wanted to do like 6 audio sound bites.
Right.
So a lot of what we did in the early days of podcasting was convince brands not to do podcasts, that they weren't going to put in what we felt like podcasting required, the commitment. And but it's been it's more accessible now with Anchor, with the tools are more accessible to the regular person.
Yep. Yeah, even Riverside, what we're using right now, it's and it is easier, but it's still work. And
it's so much work.
I would not recommend to anybody that they promote their brand with a podcast. I think you can build a brand with a podcast if the podcast is your thing. I think the podcast could be the thing that you're doing.
Right.
But you either need a lot of money, or you need to be willing to do it as sort of a hobby and create a kind of production schedule and rhythm that is sustainable and enjoyable, that you look forward to. And like in your case, it's like you talk with either a new friend or an old friend one night a week about something cool and fascinating. So you're going to look forward to that. In my case, I get to connect with my very good friend and sort of deepen our relationship in a really fun way. And we're also hoping in Upper Middlebrow too to have more guests. We've had one guest, but we're planning more and more guests too, because we want everyone to play. Like, it's fun to take apart a book or a movie. And I guess my feeling is anybody who wants to talk with us. I may live to regret saying this, but my feeling is that everybody who wants to talk with us about something, we'll try to get around to you. It might take several months. We're planning months and months and months ahead, but and that's also like I worked for Curious City in Chicago for a long time too, and the whole premise of Curious City was we're going to collaborate with our audience to make stuff. And I feel like that I did, when I came to Curious City, that seemed neat, but mostly I just was sort of like, I want to make creative, ambitious audio stories about Chicago. And I got kind of, it sort of subversively wrapped its way around my brainstem now that whenever I make anything creative, I want to engage with the audience in some way. I want to find a way to make the audience sort of part of the content too. Jennifer Brandel, the creator of Curious City, has sort of like reshaped my brain, sort of like the snow crash virus, such that I always want to do that now.
The Curious City virus is a good one, I think, to be reshaped by.
Definitely better than the snow crash virus, as those things go. Yeah, no, it's a very good one, and hopefully it infects more people in the media and in the world of cultural production and in the world of content.
Well, Jesse, let's get into your favorite thing.
Yeah.
You had sent me a couple ideas, but we decided to go with being a total surprise. So what are we talking about tonight?
Oh, okay. That I wasn't 100% sure it's a surprise, but my favorite thing it's a pair. So I could say my favorite thing is a pair of movies made by Richard Lester called The Three Musketeers and The Four Musketeers, made in 1973 and 1974. Leah, are you familiar with these movies? Do you know about them?
I'm gonna Google them quickly. I'm sure the images are gonna strike something, but no.
No. Okay.
For the most part, no.
That's great. I'm only trying to orient. You are, I'm sure, I suspect, familiar with Charlton Heston, Raquel Welch, Michael York, Christopher Lee. The cast is incredible. Michael York was the star. Who else? Richard Chamberlain, not as well known. Spike Milligan.
Looking at the pictures, it's an immediate yes.
Okay, it looks familiar to you. Well,
looks so familiar. But also looks familiar in a Three Amigos sort of way.
Right. Is it that you know that movie, or is it that you know a bunch of stuff that this movie kind of inspired, or movies that have a similar, or were taking from the same inspirations, taking from the same DNA
I think it's going to be the long legs of the work. That it inspired a lot of things I watched.
Well, and so you talked I'm trying to remember his name. Shai Corman, about a few weeks ago. I listened to that episode a few days ago, and you mentioned the Monkees TV show.
Yes.
The Monkees TV show, that entire TV show, like the comedy of it and the kind of the way they all hung out together and the look of it and sort of the bright colors, was all inspired by the movie Help about the Beatles. Richard Lester directed Help. So one of Richard Lester's influences is, I would say, the Monkees too. Although the Monkees are their own wonderful thing, and everybody kind of likes to dump on the Monkees, but they're great. Great musicians. So that's one of his tendrils. So he kind of made a name for himself making the two Beatles movies in the 1960s. And I think he kind of reached the point of a blank check, as we were describing earlier. So he had a big budget to make this movie. And I'll just give you the first 10 minutes or so of the movie, not in real time, just kind of like, here's how this movie starts. And to set the scene, it's the 80s, like 7 or 8-year-old Jesse. My parents are divorced. We're in Charlottesville, Virginia. I'm spending time with both of them, and it's the 80s, and we're not poor, but there's not a lot of money. And so cheap entertainment is really, really important. And my mom, who had been working as a waitress, got a like slightly better job as an after-school teacher. And so nights when I was with her, I have this distinctive memory of like getting a ride from my school, which was in the county, into the city by a teacher who lived nearby. And then being dropped off at my mom's after school program, where she would be till like 7 or 8 at night until like all the kids were picked up. It was probably not that late. It was maybe like 6. And then we would drive home this one way. And sometimes if I was like really lucky and she was really tired, or maybe often, we would stop at this like, it was not a box Blockbuster. It was just like a video store. It may have been like a Top 100 or something. And we would rent a couple movies, and I feel like we would never get the new ones because those were like $4.99. We'd always get the 99-cent movies. And so I can remember renting and seeing for whatever reason, I don't know if they like transferred illegally these movies to new discs, but I remember the font of the movies was just Arial type, like the Three Musketeers and the Four Musketeers. And when I saw that, I remember thinking like, oh, this is probably like from the 1950s and 60s. And as like a kid of the 80s, I had a bias against like Errol Flynn type movies. Right. So I remember thinking this is not going to be very good. And then generally speaking too, my recollection is that like either my mom would get like a Tombstone pizza, or we would order pizza. And then like the night would be like watching a movie together on the couch with pizza, which is just like the most relaxing thing to this day that I think I can do. And so the movie starts, and it starts with this like thrumming sort of like Stanley Kubrick or the Terminator synthesizer music, like thumb, 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 kind of like that. And then there's suddenly it's like dark, and suddenly there's this light on a metal sword. And it's not a like Game of Thrones broadsword. It's a kind of sword that's got more of like a fencing type sword. And the sword gets pulled slowly from the sheath, and it goes and it makes this wonderful sound. And then the sword's flying through the air and contacting another sword. And it's kind of happening in sort of weird slow motion strobing effect. And then this like other synthesizer starts, and it's actually, I went back and it's kind of cheesy because it's like a synthesizer voice doing sort of like medieval music. It's like do 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 do. I don't have the melody in my head. And then we're in a barn, and there's a middle-aged man and a very young man, and they're having a sword fight, and they're both like in the straw, and they're dusty, and it might remind you of like a scene from Pirates of the Caribbean. They're both wearing gloves. And the old man wins because he shows his son. Turns out that this is a father and son, and that he defeats the son, showing him his secret sword thrust, which is like involves a somersault. And then he says, "That's the last thing I have to teach you, son. You're ready to go to the big city now, basically. Now go say goodbye to your mother." And we have this floppy-haired farm boy played by Michael York, very handsome, very slender, poor, being sent off to the big city to seek his fame and fortune on a ridiculous kind of yellow draft horse that he's riding. And, you know, if you've seen Star Wars, the idea of kind of a floppy blonde-haired farm boy, you know, wanting to go where the action is familiar. I mean, you know, there are 1,000 stories like this, but this is only 3 or 4 years before Star Wars. So and there are other, I mean, it's impossible for me to imagine that George Lucas wasn't aware of this particular film and the Musketeers stories. So he sets off, and his parents wish him well, and he's got a little bit of money, and he's got his father's sword, and he's got a letter of introduction to the head of the King's Musketeers, and he gets to an inn, and at the inn there's this man wearing all red who's like very tall and wearing an eye patch, and he starts making fun of the horse. And the young man, whose name is D'Artagnan, gets very indignant and says, you know, "Are you talking to me?" And the man is very haughty. He's portrayed by Christopher Lee, and so in his sort of haughty Christopher Lee voice is saying something like, "No, sir, I'm talking at you," and continues to insult the horse. D'Artagnan draws his sword, wants to get into a sword fight, but this man considers fighting this peasant, this farm boy, to be beneath him as a gentleman. So he just kind of waves his arm, and his 2 servants knock D'Artagnan out, break his sword, take his money, and sort of leave him there. And this man proves to be the Count de Rochefort, who is sort of one of the chief antagonists of the next two movies. And along the way, as this is all happening, Rochefort, a carriage goes by, and a beautiful blonde woman sticks her head out of the carriage. It's Faye Dunaway. And it's very clear that they're up to something. You know, they kind of talk to each other, sort of like, you need to go to the next city here and wait further instructions. The cardinal will have further instructions for you. And so we're starting to get a sense of like machinations and intrigue. So the next scene is D'Artagnan, the young man, has recovered in the inn, and he goes into the court of the Musketeers. And we see the Musketeers for a while, and they are just like raucous bros, soldiers. You know, they're all wearing these tabards, and they have swords, and they're laughing, and they're joking, and they're gambling, and they're playing, you know, like pool, and they're boasting at each other, and they're telling stories. And you see the kind of the eponymous Three Musketeers, although you don't necessarily know who they are at this point, and they're having various interactions. And D'Artagnan, wide-eyed, walks his way through this court, up the grand stairs, and then they say, you know, Monsieur de Treville will see you now. And he goes into this private room, and there's an old man there, and the old man is Treville, who is the captain of the King's Musketeers, which is a very prestigious military company in that time. And they wear these blue tabards, and they carry swords and muskets. And he remembers D'Artagnan's father. And D'Artagnan has been sent with a letter of introduction, although I can't remember in the book, the letter of introduction is pilfered by the man who knocks him out. In this case, I'm not sure that's happened, but Treville sees him and says, you know, I remember your father very well. We were comrades together, fighting in this place and that place. And I'd love to help you, but unfortunately, there's only so much I can do. You're not allowed to join the Musketeers. You know, the king and I decided there's a rule. You have to spend at least 2 years in another regiment or distinguish yourself. So you can't be a Musketeer, but you know what I'll do? My friend's the head of the guards, this regiment. I'll give you a letter introducing you to him, and he'll probably give you a job as a guard. And, you know, D'Artagnan's like, okay, fair, that's nice. But as this conversation is happening, D'Artagnan's sort of bored, and Treville's writing something down. And there's some broad comedy, too. I think he knocks something over, and there's a lot of that in this movie. It's sort of an adventure comedy. And so he's looking out the window, and he starts shouting, "There's the man! There's the man! There's the man who knocked me out and took my sword!" And so, you know, Treville is kind of completely bemused by this and looks up, and he bows low, runs outside, runs down the stairs to try to find this man. Along the way, he bumps into all three of the Three Musketeers, and basically, I won't go into the details, but in each case, he upsets them, and they find him to be rude. And in one example, he bumps into Athos. It's Athos, Porthos, and Aramis. Athos is wounded, and he bumps into his arm, hurts him, you know, accidentally, and says, "Excuse me." And Athos says, you just bumped into my wound. All you can say is, "Excuse me, you need to be taught a lesson in manners, young man." And D'Artagnan says, "I don't need a lesson. I said, excuse me. Nonetheless, you shall have a lesson." And so they make a duel for 12 o'clock that day. He then does something similar with Porthos, and they make a duel for 1 o'clock that day. And then he does something similar with Aramis, and they make a duel for 2 o'clock that day. And he goes outside, and the man he's looking after is gone, and now he's made enemies of, like, the three most famous musketeers who are surely going to kill him in this duel, you know. So he shows up for the duel, and Athos, and I'm about wrapped up here, too. I mean, this is the sort of end of the first act. In case you were like, how much detail are we getting of this movie? He shows up for the first duel.
There are very few movies that I could go beat by beat. Like, mostly I'm just impressed.
Well, I could maybe do the whole thing beat by beat. I like it that much. But let me just get through what happens with the duels, and then we can sum up. So he shows up, Athos is there, and he kind of impresses Athos by his courtesy. You know, he says, I see that you're wounded. Is that going to inconvenience you? We could hold it off a few days until you're armed. Athos says, no, it's okay. I fight well with my left arm too. It'll be fine. He says, well, you know, I've got this kind of herbal remedy my mom gave me. It's really good for wounds. Would you like some of that? And Athos, you can tell Athos is kind of impressed by him, and sort of, he's like, kind of like, you know, you're not a bad guy. Like if I think, you know, in the book, he says something like, if we survive, maybe we'll be friends or something like that. But of course we have to fight the duel, you know, this is an affair of honor. Athos's seconds show up, because when you go to a duel, you have to have seconds, you know, to sort of arrange the rules. And of course, it's the other two musketeers, Porthos and Aramis, and this sort of like moment ensues where they're like, wait, I'm supposed to fight a duel with this guy. And D'Artagnan says, yeah, well, not until 1 and not until 2. And then D'Artagnan apologizes to Porthos and Aramis because they might not have the opportunity to kill him because Athos might kill him first. And again, Porthos and Aramis are sort of impressed by this charming young man. And so they're about to start the fight, and then the Cardinal's guards show up, and there's an edict against dueling, and there's 6 of the Cardinal's guards, and you can tell the Cardinal's guards are really hoping the Musketeers will not be arrested peacefully, but will instead choose to resist so that they can have a brawl, because the Cardinal's guards, the Cardinal and the King are kind of the twin rulers of France, and they're kind of frenemies, and the Cardinal's guards and the Musketeers are rivals, and they don't like each other. So this is like an opportunity for the Cardinal's guards to, like, you know, get in a fight with the Musketeers, and they're spoiling for that. And of course the Musketeers don't mind that idea either. But Aramis points out, you know, there's only 3 of us and there's 6 of them. And D'Artagnan says, no, there's 4 of us, you know, not 3 of us. And there's this moment of like, wait, you're not one of us. And he says, I have the heart of a musketeer. And they're like, well, okay, you can join us. And so the 3 musketeers plus D'Artagnan fight the Cardinal's guards. And D'Artagnan is brilliant, and they win that fight. And then they all become friends. And that's kind of the opening sequence. And that kind of then sets off the adventures of the next 2 movies. And it's kind of the origin stories of, you know, well, they're already the 3 Musketeers, but, you know, as I said, the latter movie is called the Four Musketeers. So that'll give you a sense of the trajectory of D'Artagnan.
That he fully levels up.
Yes, there's some leveling up that happens in the course of the movie.
Yeah. So the first time you see the movie, you are anticipating it's not going to be good, because it's just like, at this point, it's been photocopied so many times that they've just typed out the name.
Yeah, and I thought maybe it would be kind of like, now I would probably enjoy a movie like this, but, you know, you see these kind of like Errol Flynn or Douglas Fairbanks or sort of older like 1950s sword fighting movies that, as a kid, to me seemed kind of fakey and cheesy too. So that's what I was thinking. Yeah. But at this point, I'm all in. I'm like, this is awesome. This is amazing.
And so growing up, I grew up in Indiana where we would rent VCRs from U-Haul. And U-Haul also had a movie, like you could also rent movies there. And we would sometimes rent 2 VCRs to tape, you know, to build up our home collection. Yeah. Is there a point where you get a home copy of this, or does it become a favorite that you rent regularly? We had
neighbors with 2 VCRs. And so I think that, like, maybe they had a copy. Certainly at a certain point, my parents' financial fortune became better. So I think by the time I was in high school, they probably owned a copy. But I imagine we probably rented it again a few years later when I was maybe more like 11 or 12. And I remember, because I sort of recall watching it in another house when my stepfather had entered the picture, and having another night on the couch and watching it then too. Yeah. And then I don't recall ever owning a copy of it, but I know my aunt did, and I suspect that probably at some point my parents bought a like double pack with the 2 discs pack, or the 2 VHSs. So I think by the time I was in college, it sort of was owned in the family, and I, would probably see it every 5 to 10 years or so. But it may have gone. I may go 10 years. Like I hadn't seen it for a while until pretty recently, and I had that ache of like, oh, I haven't seen those movies for a while. And somebody on Twitter was complaining about one of the recent Musketeer things. Like I think there's a TV show, and I remember saying something like. Somebody said something like, I don't like Musketeers movies with black leather. And I commented something to the effect of, I don't like Musketeers movies that don't have Charlton Heston, Michael York, Oliver Reed, Christopher, basically, right. Although I agreed with the thing about black leather, there's way too much black leather in the newer movies, but I found a way of, and that probably triggered me into sort of like, oh yeah, I haven't seen those movies in a while. I'd better watch them again. And see if they're as good as I remember them being.
Yeah. Is black leather historically inaccurate?
I think.
Or
yeah, I think so. I mean, I think black leather gloves might be accurate enough. But
yeah,
if you see, in sort of the same way that like there was a time where like all the Marvel superheroes were suddenly in black leather, like around
sure.
Was it the first X-Men movie? I don't believe the Musketeers wore all leather or very much leather. They would have probably worn sort of like pantaloons and kind of cotton or linen shirts, sort of like pirate clothing, and then they had those tabards. They might have had leather boots, and they might have had leather gloves. I mean, I'm not an expert in the era, but actually one of the things I really like about this movie was there was an awful lot of attention put into the costume and also into the accuracy of kind of like the sword fighting equipment too. And, I was talking with you earlier about how I didn't necessarily like those 1950s movies where they were fencing. This is not a fencing movie. The sword fighting, the action sequences are more like brawls. And that was very, very intentional. Richard Lester wanted that, and the fight choreographer wanted that, and they would plan them out. But if you watch the action sequences, I think it did sort of change the way that kind of sword fighting action was done in movies now. And so like films like Pirates of the Caribbean or the Lord of the Rings films, I think now are sort of a little bit more like the 1973, 1974 Three Musketeers, where it looks like a brawl and like people are kind of like eye gouging and kicking dirt and grabbing whatever they can and parrying with their hat, and
right.
And
it's not Olympic level épée fighting.
It's not that,
right.
Nor is it sort of like beautiful Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, elegant dancing, sort of Asian-inspired martial arts either, which is wonderful and beautiful in its own way. They're down and dirty. It looks like, every now and again they'll use the sword like a club. They look tired. They look desperate. There's blood. It's not overly gory, but there's blood where appropriate too. And there's an interesting, every now and again they'll kind of break the spell of that with some kind of almost like Charlie Chaplin or Buster Keaton kind of physical humor to the violence too. There's a certain amount of like every now and again, sometimes there'll be sort of visual jokes that will sort of make fun of that kind of fencing Errol Flynn era. Like there's one, the character of Porthos he's understood to be kind of a buffoon, sort of lovable buffoon. And there's a moment where he and Aramis are escaping a castle, and Aramis does something that's straight out of, I think, Errol Flynn's Robin Hood, where he grabs the rope to a gate, cuts underneath the rope, and the gate falls down, and the rope pulls him up.
He goes like through the window or something?
Yeah, he gets pulled to the top of the wall.
Yeah.
And Porthos looks and is like, Aramis is like, do that. And he looks at it, grabs the rope, cuts the rope, but doesn't quite understand the physics of what he's doing, so he cuts the rope above his arm, and the rope goes up in the air, and the gate falls to the ground. So not only does he not get carried to the wall, but he's now trapped, by the gate in the place where he was trying to escape. So there's, a little bit of a visual joke there. And there are a few other moments like that. There's a moment where D'Artagnan tries to pull the rug out of a bunch of people, sort of do the old, I'm going to pull the rug and everyone's going to fall down.
Right.
And the rug just rips. And then he's sitting there holding the rug. And, there's, and there's a little, every now and again they'll do these overdubs too. So one of the soldiers says, he ripped our rug, and then he sort of drops the rug and runs away. But there'll be these little moments like that are clearly alluding to earlier eras of action film and sword fighting. And I don't know, maybe they kind of break the spell because sometimes the fights do seem very down and dirty and realistic. And then that's clearly a joke and clearly a sort of winking joke. But I don't know, to me, it's never bothered me to have that kind of comedy mixed into the action. Although sometimes that does bother me. Like, it drives me crazy in the Lord of the Rings. There's a moment where what's his name? The Legolas character kind of like snowboards down some stairs on a shield, and I found that very annoying. It just felt like I was like, you're not even taking this seriously anymore. You're not even trying. Yeah. But I don't know why. Maybe it's because I was a kid when this film came out, so that those elements. I was actually not alive when this film came out, but I was a kid when I first saw this film. And so maybe I forgive some of the moments that kind of break the spell of the realism that way.
So for you, when you saw Three Amigos, you knew immediately what it was riffing on.
Yeah, well, yes, although I would
maybe not.
I would also say that the Three Amigos was also very much riffing on like serial, like certainly it's the Three Musketeers, the Three Amigos, but it's also Zorro, and it's also like 1940s and 1950s Hollywood westerns too. And and that that came out a little bit later. I remember when that one came out, and even in that one they're sort of in that movie there are a lot of jokes about how these guys are actors and not real gunfighters too. So yeah, they're actors who could have been in a movie like a Douglas Fairbanks Robin Hood. I mean, I'm sure there were some 1950s and 1940s versions of the Three Musketeers. I've never actually, I mean, the story goes back to Alexandre Dumas' novel from 1844, which I should say, I remember my mom reading me that book, and it would be interesting to ask if it was a favorite. I remember her reading it aloud to me when I was a little kid, and then I also remember having the Classics Illustrated comic book. Which I think Richard Lester was influenced by, because some of the costume design of the 1973-1974 film is very similar to the Classics Illustrated, and I could imagine, and I think the Classics Illustrated books came out in the 40s or something, so I could imagine Richard Lester taking that to the costume design and saying, I want this guard to look like this, with the kind of like pantaloons and the shield and the kind of stripy arms, or that I saw from this book, the Classics Illustrated book.
So it's interesting. I did an interview a couple years ago. Sean, his last name escapes me at the moment, about historical European martial arts, which is sword stuff, and how he trains with people about about this type of fighting. And like in Germany it was like this, in England it was like this, in France it was here, and he competes in historical European martial arts. And it is like the grittier, you have a sword or something, but it is like also grappling and wrestling. It's super intense.
Well, and it would be interesting to ask Sean if he's familiar with these films. I have found that, and I should say, like, the connections to latter films, that's something I've kind of pieced together later. It's not like when I saw Pirates of the Caribbean for the first time, I was like, oh, they're just ripping off like the Three Musketeers. It's later when I'm kind of thinking about it, and I'm like, well, where would they have gotten sort of the idea for Johnny Depp kind of quipping that way at Orlando Bloom? And then I'm like, oh, that's kind of like, that's kind of like Athos and D'Artagnan. And I'm not, and certainly in the Lord of the Rings, like, Gimli and Legolas are Porthos and Aramis. Like that relationship, the sort of that kind of comedic relationship, and one of them being kind of the sort of bloviator and kind of full of himself, and the other one sort of needling him a little bit, but there also being great affection between those two characters. Like it's to some degree it's in the books. It's in both original books too, but it's also like it like Porthos sounds like Gimli, Frank Finlay was the actor, John Rhys Davies is the actor. I mean, they sound the same. But so it would be interesting. I've interviewed a fight choreographer who says the movies were kind of legendary for a number of reasons. And one of the reasons was that Richard Lester did sort of, he didn't want to do that fencing, which I heard Christopher Lee describe it as a kind of Hungarian style fencing that Douglas Fairbanks, Basil Rathbone, I don't know about Errol Flynn, but a lot of these actors from the 40s and 50s were quite skilled at. But basically he did some research and was like, fighting at that era didn't look like that. They weren't fencing with each other. They were doing something else.
Right.
And that, in fact, he read that in the time that the movie was set, which is the early 1700s, I think. I think I have that right. Early 1700s, that the swords were not little, fencing rapiers. They were bigger, and so they hacked with the right arm, and then they parried with the left arm. And parrying, there's some word for it, but you'd have like a little. Sometimes you'd have a little sort of parrying sword, but you also, like, maybe you would use a coat, or maybe you'd use your hat if you couldn't afford something like that. So that it was this was a very particular style of fighting that Richard Lester read about and then worked with the fight choreographers to kind of revive. So, and it is the weight is on the front foot instead of the back foot. But then it also, I think that element of, down and dirty, throwing dirt in people's eye, grabbing whatever you have available, was also something he wanted to create. And I think that's probably true in any era where people fight each other, that in any, it's not like fighting has ever looked beautiful and elegant when people are actually trying to hurt each other or kill each other. It always looks like that. It's always gritty and confusing and weird and stumbling, and you can make that look, appropriately awful, in certain types of war movies, or say Game of Thrones, or you can make it look sort of adventurous, like Richard Lester's Three Musketeers and Four Musketeers too. And maybe arguably that's a little bit irresponsible, but I didn't grow up wanting to be a sword fighter for real. I feel like as a kid I could separate the idea that you probably don't really want to be a sword fighter. Right. You're not going to live a very long, prosperous, happy life if you're constantly trying to stick people with a piece of metal and have them do that to you.
Right.
Your days are probably numbered.
Have you ever seen them in the theater? Like, did Music Box ever show them and you got to see them on the big screen?
No, and that's kind of why I wanted to talk with you about them, because I feel like these movies are, I listened to your interview with Robert Lorzell, who we know in common, and he talked about Space Odyssey.
2001.
Yeah, 2001.
Yeah.
That movie shows up at the Music Box. When I lived in Charlottesville, I was a student there. We had the Virginia Film Festival, and they would show, like French noir films. They would show Metropolis. I've never seen these in a theater. Never. And, they'll show Star Wars. They'll show The Terminator at film festivals. They'll show other... it's not like film festivals or the Music Box are afraid of action adventure, the genre. It just seems like these films, for how influential they are and how good I think they are, and I've got other reasons I think they're really, really good, and how I believe I'm not the only person who thinks this. Steven Soderbergh has a book where he interviewed the director Richard Lester. Like, a lot of people talk about Richard Lester. A lot of people talk about these actors. I mean, Christopher Lee is legendary. I think there are a lot of people in film who like these movies. So it's kind of astounding to me that they haven't, that as far, I mean, maybe they were at the Music Box and I was out of town, you know, or it's not like it's not like I know everything that appears there, or the, you know, Gene Siskel Center, or maybe they came to a film festival somewhere, but as I have never seen them at a festival, I've never seen them on the big screen, and I would love it too, because another thing that's amazing about them, and if you've been Googling around, the color is so vivid. And Richard Lester was kind of famous when he made Help. He made it in color. You know, A Hard Day's Night, the prior Beatles film, was in black and white, and it's considered, I don't know why, but it's considered sort of innovative in its use of color. I don't know if it's because of something like the film stock that was available in the 1960s or the costuming, but certainly 1973, 1974, you can tell it's shot on film. It's shot beautifully on film. The colors of the costumes are vivid. There are a number of frames from the movie that look like oil paintings, you know, that, and some of that is the use of color too. So I would love to see it in a big theater, and I would love to see, you know, if they shot it on whatever it's, you know, what is it, 78 millimeter originally, I'd love to see the extra large print of it with the vivid colors, you know. And I think, right, you know, I stream it on Amazon or something like that, and I've seen it on pretty good VHS, but it would be amazing to see a really, really good print.
Yeah, it seems like it would be, they were doing a series for a while called, I think it was like, Is It Still Funny? And that was when I got to see Harold and Maude on the big screen for the first time. And so they will, you know, and 2001 is special because I think the Music Box, I think their film distribution arm helped restore it or help fund the restoration.
Right, that's part of their business, right? Yeah.
Yeah. But they do, right now they're doing is it Billy Wilder series? I think.
I'm out of town, so I haven't been paying attention.
Yeah.
But I mean, you know, like,
it seems to me like, just consider this, Music Box. I know you're listening, or I'll tag you. They're not listening. But I think a Richard Lester, you know, like doing looking at what his movies are, they would all be incredible to see on the big screen.
Yeah, and they did. I mean, I don't know if it was Music Box, but you do see Hard Day's Night pop up, and from time to time. And but yeah, like Lester also did How I Won the War, which had John Lennon in it, kind of an arty film too. And I don't, you know, honestly don't know much about his latter career. I've been reading a little bit more about him. I believe a colleague of mine, former colleague, interviewed him in the 80s, and he'd kind of, or 90s, and he'd sort of fallen on hard times, if I'm remembering correctly, too. It's yeah, I mean, and the other, I mean, Lester, I think, is a filmmaker, yes, you could totally do a revival like that with. I mean, watch the Beatles films and watch these two, and there's maybe one or two others, and lots of people would love to see that. I also think Christopher Lee is obviously a legend. To me, the absolute standout performance, and you know, Charlton Heston is amazing. Faye Dunaway is amazing. Raquel Welch, think of her, I don't necessarily think of her as a great actress, but she performs in a kind of comic role, and she's brilliant, and she's perfect. And Michael York is exactly the kind of, you know, Mark Hamill type, you know, Mark Hamill before Mark Hamill that you would need him to be, you know, sort of like energetic and innocent. You know, he's got that kind of innocent, boyish, innocent fool in a complicated world who succeeds in spite of his foolishness through sort of like luck and affection, and the chemistry between him and the Musketeers, who are all supposed to be in their 30s, feels very, very real. You sense the affection. But to me, the real standout performance is Oliver Reed. And you know, I don't think Oliver Reed is a household name in the United States. I think people who are really into film recognize him. He was in Gladiator. He in a sort of similar role, like the Russell Crowe Gladiator film. He was the kind of like gladiator trainer. and he was in The Adventures of Baron von Munchausen, and he was in some Italian B movies in the 60s and 70s. He's also, I believe, had a pretty distinguished theater career too, but he died kind of young. I think he was a kind of classic British, hard drinking, raconteur, stays up all night and then shows up at on set the next day, but he has all his lines memorized. But his performance in these movies, to me, just like it gives it, he's got this kind of darkness and depth and gravitas, and he's playing kind of a mentor figure to D'Artagnan, and you can tell that he's got a special affection for him, but he also has kind of a haunted, dark past, and that past in the second movie kind of appears to drive the plot and haunt him and haunt the other characters in a way. And the intensity, and I think he acts with his eyes in a way, but he also has this kind of deep voice. But I just, when I'm watching the movie, I'm just magnetized whenever he's on the screen. And there are these other amazing actors that he's acting with too, but I think like Oliver Reed's performance in this is so incredible. And it's made me, I've kind of like, I have a sort of, queue of movies to look for of sort of earlier Oliver Reed films, because he wasn't, I think he was a successful working actor. His grandfather was Sir Carol Reed, who directed The Third Man, but I think maybe he was more of a theater actor because he's not in a ton of movies, but, steady. Seems like he was working steadily.
Yeah. Huh. Is there anything else about the Three Musketeers or the Four Musketeers that you haven't mentioned that you would be sad if we hung up without saying?
Well, okay, so I mentioned the oil paintings. I guess the one thing I would say is that I think there are elements of it that don't age well, too. And I do think there's a certain amount of sexism. I think there's sexism in Alexandre Dumas' story, but that the women characters, even though there's two women who are excellently portrayed and brilliantly acted, their role is to sort of create emotional stakes for the men in the movie. And I think that's unfortunate. Also, everybody's white pretty much in the movie.
Right.
And on one hand, you can kind of make the argument that, like, well, okay, it's set in 1712 France, so it wouldn't make sense to have people who weren't white, except for Alexandre Dumas was biracial or multiracial. Like, his grandmother, I believe, was black, and there were, people from the Caribbean in France at that time. So I certainly think that the movie is a product of some of the worst aspects of both the time it was written, but also the time that the movie was made. And I think the sexism could be very painful to watch. And there's also a lot of casual cruelty of the servants that's sort of played for humor.
Yeah.
A kind of classism too. And I think maybe Richard Lester feels like he's doing a kind of ironic social commentary by pointing out the hypocrisy of it, but it seems like they're having a little bit too much fun with it throughout the film, I think, too.
Yeah.
So I don't know, if I'm recommending, I would love for people to go out and watch it, but I just want to acknowledge, like, I think those problematic aspects are there, and I also think it's probably easier for those particular things for me to shrug those particular ones off, since I'm not the vulnerable party necessarily in any of those, and it might be harder for other people. It might be more painful for somebody else to watch the film in the midst of the sexism and classism and overbearing whiteness of the whole thing.
Yeah. I'm gonna have to. So you watch it? It's on Amazon.
Yeah, I believe it's on Amazon. I know the first one's on
Nice.
Amazon. I think I have a copy of the second one. Like, I have a DVD that I burned or something like that. So,
Yeah.
they are there. And I would say, look for, when you're watching it, think about Star Wars, think about Raiders of the Lost Ark, think about Pirates of the Caribbean, think about Lord of the Rings. I mean, I just think that, this came before all of those films. I'm not sure that those movies would be the same without these two. It may be that the creators of those other ones were drawing on similar sources of inspiration. But I don't know. I mean, the duels between Christopher Lee and Michael York, the sort of tall, scary middle-aged guy fighting the floppy farm duel, it's just like the Luke and Darth Vader series of lightsaber fights. It's just hard for me to imagine that Lucas didn't have the visual of that, of the one being much taller than the other, and some of the shots where you sort of see that, see Darth Vader kind of looming over Luke Skywalker in Empire Strikes Back, like, when they have their first sword fight.
Or even the series of duels in Princess Bride between Wesley.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
that's my primary sword fight. I mean, I've seen all of the Star Wars, but like Princess Bride, I've seen many, many times.
And the kinds of swords that Carrie Elways and Mandy Patinkin have in that movie, it's exact same. It's the same look. They're doing that style of action, and even the way they're bantering with each other the entire time, that's exactly the same too.
But I feel like they were much more clearly winking to the movies that they knew came before. It's a more self-aware movie.
Yeah, I think.
Does that make sense?
I think that's right, because it was also a very self-aware book. I don't know if you've ever read the Princess Bride book, but the whole book is sort of written as. I mean, first of all, it's a book within a book, right? Like and it's sort of like we discovered this book that was from another era. So there's I think there are layers of it, and I think with the 3 or 4 Musketeers film, they're not winking quite as much, although I did mention the moment of cutting the rope gates, but they're not winking as they're doing it. It's more of it's a reference that's there if you're paying attention.
If you know.
If you didn't know,
it's a reward.
Yeah, it's a reward. If you didn't know, it would just be a kind of funny moment, in the same way that Johnny Depp's sort of prancing around in Pirates of the Caribbean. If you sort of understand that he's basing that on Keith Richards, that makes it extra funny. But even if you don't know it, it's still funny. Although, unfortunately, I now can't think about Johnny Depp without thinking about the recent, trial and allegations and what we've learned about their marriage. So I don't know that those films are quite as enjoyable to me anymore.
Yeah. I actually don't know if I've seen any of the Pirates of the Caribbean. Somehow they kind of missed. I don't remember when they started coming out, but it hit a movie dry spell for me, and I just never caught on.
Yeah, I remember when the first one came. It must have been about 2004, 2005, because I remember where I lived, and I remember it was in rural Maine. I remember seeing it at the theater in rural Maine, and I think the first one is probably worth your time at some point in your life. Although, maybe not. I don't know that those films have aged particularly well either, and I would certainly recommend you watch Richard Lester's 1973 Three Musketeers and 1974 Four Musketeers first. If that wasn't clear from the last hour and a half.
That is clear. That's clear. Jesse, where can people find you on the internet? Do you want to be found?
Yeah, at Curious Dukes on Twitter. I'm still on Twitter. I'm waiting and seeing what's going to happen. I don't have any really good alternatives to Twitter right now, so at Curious Dukes. Also, you can go to uppermiddlebrow.com, and you can find Upper Middlebrow wherever you get your podcasts, unless you get your podcast from a very strange place that I've never heard of. Like unless you're, your grandson burns them to a CD for you, that you probably couldn't get them there. You'd probably have to find some other way to get your podcasts. But, if you do the usual things, you can search for Upper. Upper is one word. Middlebrow is one word. So 2 total words. Upper Middlebrow.
Fantastic. Well, Jesse, thank you so much. This has been a delight.
It was a total delight. Thank you, Leah.
Thank you for listening to Finding Favorites with Leah Jones. Please make sure to subscribe and drop us a 5-star review on iTunes. Now, go out and enjoy your favorite things.